The walls of the monarchy were never meant to crack in public. Yet behind the polished gates and carefully rehearsed smiles, a storm had already begun tearing through the family from the inside. What started as whispers over inheritance and private property soon turned into a brutal confrontation powerful enough to shake the crown itself. Nobody expected Prince Edward, the quiet son who spent most of his life avoiding headlines, to become the man willing to challenge the institution protecting the king. But when pressure reportedly began building around Bagshot Park and deeply personal possessions tied to his wife Sophie, something changed. Suddenly, the man long dismissed as harmless was standing behind closed doors with legal files thick enough to silence palace officials within minutes. Those documents were not emotional pleas or family arguments. They were signed agreements, witness letters, financial records, and years of carefully protected evidence proving that what had been handed to Edward by Queen Elizabeth II was never meant to be touched again. According to insiders, the atmosphere inside royal offices became ice cold the moment the paperwork landed on the table because the files allegedly exposed something the monarchy could never afford the public fully understanding, that the late Queen had quietly prepared protections for Edward and Sophie long before her death. She had seen tensions building inside the institution for years. She knew the monarchy was changing, becoming leaner, colder, more controlled, and she reportedly feared that once she was gone, certain promises might suddenly become negotiable. That fear is believed to be the reason she personally tied Bagshot Park to the Duke of Edinburgh title before she died, ensuring the estate and the honour could never easily be separated. To outsiders, Bagshot Park may look like another enormous royal mansion hidden behind trees and gates, but for Edward it represented far more than wealth. It symbolized legitimacy, stability, and the final blessing of both his parents. The estate had once been neglected and nearly abandoned before Edward reportedly poured enormous amounts of private money into restoring it. Unlike other royals accused over the years of benefiting from royal privilege without contribution, Edward quietly invested his own earnings into repairing the property while avoiding scandal, avoiding drama, and staying loyal to the institution his entire life. That loyalty, however, seemed to mean very little once financial pressure and control entered the conversation. As reviews of royal spending intensified, attention allegedly shifted toward properties and assets viewed as financially valuable. Bagshot Park suddenly became impossible to ignore. By then, its value had risen dramatically, transforming from an unwanted burden into one of the monarchy's most desirable estates. According to sources close to the situation, Edward realized early that if he failed to defend his position legally, he risked losing not only the home but the independence attached to it. The deeper issue was never simply about land. It was about whether a monarch's personal promises still carried meaning after death. If signed agreements made by Queen Elizabeth II could quietly be reconsidered, what exactly inside the royal system remained untouchable anymore? That question reportedly began echoing through palace corridors as legal advisors reviewed documents carrying the signatures of both the late Queen and Prince Philip himself. Philip's involvement changed everything. The idea that he had personally ensured protection for Edward before dying gave the matter enormous emotional weight. It suggested he had anticipated future pressure and deliberately prepared his youngest son for the battle ahead. By the time the legal confrontation fully erupted, this was no longer a private disagreement between family members. It had become a dangerous test of authority, legacy, and trust inside the monarchy itself. Every move risked exposing fractures the palace spends enormous effort trying to hide. Yet the situation became even more explosive when attention reportedly shifted from property to Sophie's personal jewelry. What might have appeared publicly as a simple administrative review allegedly felt, inside the family, like a deeply personal attack. At the center stood the tiara Sophie wore on her wedding day, a piece said to have been commissioned specifically for her by Queen Elizabeth II. For years it represented not only her place within the family, but also the late Queen's affection toward her. Unlike other senior royals granted broad access to famous jewels and state collections, Sophie's relationship with royal jewelry had always appeared far more modest. The tiara became symbolic because it was hers alone. According to reports, attempts to classify it as crown property ignited fury behind closed doors. Edward's legal team allegedly responded immediately, producing documents proving the tiara had been gifted privately, not loaned institutionally. That distinction mattered enormously because if personal gift from the late Queen could suddenly be reclaimed under royal authority, it would create consequences reaching far beyond Sophie. The argument threatened to blur the line between private ownership and royal control across the entire family. For Edward, the issue was no longer just legal, it became deeply emotional. Sophie had reportedly viewed Queen Elizabeth II not simply as a monarch but as family in the truest sense, especially after losing her own mother years earlier. Protecting those gifts became, in many ways, protecting the memory and intentions of the woman who had entrusted them to her. By the time tensions reached their peak, Buckingham Palace was no longer dealing with a quiet disagreement hidden behind velvet curtains. The atmosphere inside the royal household had reportedly become divided, tense, and dangerously unstable. Staff members who had spent years serving different branches of the family were said to be quietly choosing sides, while private conversations once protected by royal secrecy allegedly began leaking beyond palace walls. What made the situation particularly explosive was a growing sense that this was no longer merely about legal ownership or financial control. It had become a battle over the future direction of the monarchy itself. On one side stood a vision focused on tighter control, modernization, central authority, and reducing the independence of individual royals. On the other stood those determined to protect the old understanding of loyalty, personal trust, and promises made by the late Queen during her reign. According to reports, one of the most dramatic turning points came when Princess Anne personally stepped into the conflict, and has spent decades building a reputation as perhaps the hardest working and most disciplined member of the royal family. She avoids public drama, rarely speaks emotionally, and almost never intervenes openly in internal disputes. That is precisely why her involvement reportedly stunned everyone. Insiders claim that when Anne entered private meeting with King Charles, she did not arrive as a mediator seeking peace. She arrived defending what she believed their mother had deliberately put in place before her death. Her warning was said to be blunt and impossible to ignore. If signed promises from Queen Elizabeth II could suddenly be challenged after her passing, then the credibility of the monarchy itself would begin collapsing from the inside, and allegedly argued that a monarch's authority depends entirely on trust. Trust that signatures, agreements, and personal commitments actually mean something. Once that trust disappears, the entire structure weakens. According to accounts from those close to the palace, Anne's position became even firmer after reviewing the financial details surrounding Bagshot Park. She reportedly believed Edward had honored every obligation placed upon him, investing his own money, maintaining the estate properly, and following every legal term attached to the agreement. In her eyes, there was nothing left to dispute, but perhaps what affected her most deeply was Sophie's position in all this. Anne is believed to have developed a close relationship with Sophie during Queen Elizabeth II's final years, especially after the death of Prince Philip. Shared grief brought them together in ways outsiders rarely noticed. By the time the Queen passed away, Sophie had become one of the few people invisibly trusted emotionally. That personal bond reportedly transformed the conflict entirely, and no longer viewed the issue as abstract paperwork or legal complexity. She saw someone she cared about being pressured over deeply personal belongings connected to the memory of the late Queen. Sources suggest that memories of Princess Diana also weighed heavily on and during this period. She had witnessed, years earlier, how isolation and institutional pressure could quietly destroy a person inside the royal system. Watching tension build again around another woman inside the family allegedly triggered old frustrations and had kept buried for decades. This time, however, she was unwilling to remain silent. Reports claim she warned that if the pressure against Edward and Sophie continued, she would support broader scrutiny of royal finances and internal decisions, including areas linked closely to the Queen's household itself. That threat carried enormous weight because Anne's reputation for discipline and honesty makes her one of the few royals whose words still command almost universal respect. Suddenly, what had started as a dispute over a house and a tiara evolved into something far more dangerous, a confrontation capable of exposing fractures within the monarchy to the entire world. Even outside palace walls, public sympathy reportedly began shifting toward Edward and Sophie. Many people viewed Edward as a royal who had quietly fulfilled his duties for decades without scandal, celebrity behavior, or constant demand for attention. The idea that he might lose property he had restored using his own funds reportedly created unease among royal supporters already exhausted by years of controversy surrounding the family. According to insiders, King Charles eventually attempted to calm the situation privately through direct communication, hoping to resolve matters as family rather than through lawyers. Yet by then the damage had already been done. Edward reportedly refused any meeting without legal representation present, a move that insiders described as deeply symbolic. It signaled that trust between the brothers had broken down completely. Once lawyers become permanent fixtures inside family conversations, relationships rarely return to what they once were. Palace staff allegedly understood immediately that the conflict had crossed a line from which there was no simple return. The monarchy, long built on carefully managed appearances of unity, was now struggling to contain divisions growing sharper behind closed doors with every passing day. Late that evening, after hours of legal discussions, private warnings, and escalating tension, the outcome reportedly arrived with chilling simplicity. A formal notice was sent confirming that Sophie would retain exclusive private possession of the tiara. At almost the same time, any review surrounding Bagshot Park quietly disappeared from active discussion. Publicly, no dramatic announcement was made. There were no televised statements, no emotional interviews, and no visible scenes of confrontation. But inside royal circles, the message was unmistakable. The challenge had failed. Everything Queen Elizabeth II had placed into Edward, and Sophie's hands remained exactly where she intended it to stay. Yet victory did not restore peace. According to those familiar with the aftermath, the emotional damage left behind inside the family proved far more serious than the legal battle itself.